Okay, friends, controversial? Yes. Let's make a controversial video here. The 10 greatest Formula One drivers of all time. In my opinion, Cassio Cortez's opinion on Cassio Cortez's channel. Yeah, what's the criteria? Let's establish the criteria. First, it's Cassio Cortez's opinion, right? That's already established, but let's go. I can't stand people who say, oh, but you can't compare. You see, they were different eras. Car racing as a sport has been exactly the same for about 120 years, right? Since I think the first car race happened, and it's very simple. By the way, I have this awesome t-shirt that I bought at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. The first car race started when the second car was made, so the sport is still exactly the same. You get into this box with four wheels, right? In the case of Formula One, it's an open box, and you try to beat the other 20-something guys who are also in open boxes with four wheels. Of course, Formula One is fascinating. Why? Because historically, there are 10, 11, 12 teams, each one making their own box, so the boxes are different, and even today, the same team can't make two identical boxes, right? Without having to think too hard. Last year, Tsunoda had that crash in Imola, and then for 3 or 4 more races, he didn't have the same floor that Max had. But that's what makes the debate fascinating, right? You need to go beyond the numbers, beyond the obvious. You need to analyze and dig deeper into the information, look at the accounts from that time, the opinions of the grid. And for me, that's the main criterion. How much fear does that put in your heart, Rogerino? Each driver in his era would put pressure on the competition, and this thing about putting panic in the hearts of your rivals has a lot to do, above all, with pure speed. So, you'll see that my list prioritizes that a bit. Not just the guys who won the most or had the best results, but also compared to the rest of the grid. They knew that ultimately the guy is better, faster, more complete, and will find a way to win. And we have names that had very clear eras, right? Over more than a year in Formula One, right? Each name in this top 10 managed to be the guy who put the most fear into the hearts of the other 20 for 2, 3, sometimes 5, 6, 7 years. So, without further ado, let's get to our 10th place, with one more ado, actually. I set another criterion, which won't be the criterion for my list, but in this era where AI does a lot of interesting things for us, I asked ChatGPT to make a medal table for Formula One of all time, right? If being champion was gold, runner-up was silver, and third place was bronze, which drivers would have the most medals in the history of Formula One. So, these are pretty surprising numbers. We're going to show a bit of this fictional medal table to help out as well. Let's put things into perspective. Now, the 10th greatest Formula One driver of all time, Andreas Nicklaus Lauda. And I said there wouldn't be so much focus on numbers, but I will bring at least one interesting statistic about each of these top 10 drivers, which helps explain why the guy is in the top 10. So Niki Lauda, Nicklaus, the famous Niki Nicklaus, whose cap I had, look how crazy that is. My parents went on their honeymoon to Buenos Aires in '77. I think that's the year they got married. At that time, tire testing, right, it didn't exist yet since it was pay to play. Pre-season tire testing was in the southern hemisphere, of course, because of the European winter, and it was in Buenos Aires. And my parents, just imagine a Formula One tire test in 1977. They visited the racetrack, it was open, and no one charged admission. Just imagine Liberty Media nowadays letting people just walk in during practice. And then my dad was walking there, and Niki Nicklaus's cap flew off. He picked it up and offered it back. And Niki Nicklaus said, no, you can keep it. So Niki Nicklaus, smiling, even though he was still recovering from his 1976 accident, right? Yeah, which also puts into perspective the fact that Niki Nicklaus is only a 3-time champion. Actually, he's a 4-time champion, right? Niki Nicklaus was champion in 75, 77, and 84. Then he stopped, was out for 3 years, and came back. When he came back, he beat the fast young guy of the moment, who was Prost, on the same team, in the same car, right? That's something we're going to talk about in a moment. Yeah, and when he retired, he held the record for podiums. He had 54 podiums, right? Another really interesting trivia about Niki Nicklaus. The 2 biggest teams of all time in Formula One, undeniably, Ferrari and McLaren, right? Both in terms of history and numbers. The only guy to be champion with both teams, Niki Nicklaus. Look how interesting that is. Drum roll for our 9th place, another 3-time champion, Jack Stewart, right? He held the record for wins and podiums when he retired, 27 wins and 43 podiums, right? Lauda, who would later break Stewart's record with 54. But it's that thing, right? The guy was a bit more cerebral, 17 poles versus 27 wins, right? He wasn't really a guy known for explosive speed. And he stopped at his peak, right? Stewart actually has an impressive win percentage, 27%. That's an interesting mark, right? Stewart has 99 GPs, 27 wins. Yeah, all the great Formula One drivers, except for Fangio, obviously. You don't need a spoiler here, right? You know we're going to talk about Fangio later. It ends up being more or less around that 30% range, right? Not all of them, the great ones, right? Some of the greats, it's a recurring number. And Stewart is one of those guys. Yeah, he stopped at his peak, right? He stopped as a champion. He retired after François Sévère died, right? In the same year that his teammate François Sévère died. He very intelligently, showing how cerebral he was, said, look, let me cash out of this account, leave this career with a huge profit, being a three-time Formula One champion. He then focused even more on what he was already well known for in Formula One history. Being a kind of great activist, an advocate, let's say, for safety on the tracks, right? So Stewart, three-time champion, 9th place. From 8th place on, things start to get more interesting, more controversial, right? I put Alain Prost in 8th place. Alain Prost. Alain Prost from France, in the words of Galvan Bueno. 4-time champion, right, in terms of number of titles. He's tied for 4th all-time, right? We have the 7 titles of Schumacher and Hamilton, the 5 of Fangio. And then Vettel and Prost are tied with 4. And now Verstappen is also in that group, right? But Prost was never a spectacular guy. You know, in terms of pure speed, he's the famous professor, a very cerebral guy, right? Ed Straw, who's a great English journalist, in one of those debates, I heard him say, tell me the 2 or 3 most spectacular wins of Prost's career. You can't really think of any, can you? Prost didn't win spectacularly. He just knew how to maximize the car, even when breakdowns were common. He could even have more titles. Because he hit the peak of his speed as a young driver with the Renault Turbo when he got a lot of pole positions. He won a lot of races, but if you look at Prost's years in 82 and 83 with the Renault Turbo, it's 5 wins and 10 retirements. That's pretty much how the seasons went, right? The car broke down a lot. So in those peak years of his speed, he didn't capitalize on them with titles. But the numbers are undeniable, right? It's 4 titles and 4 runner-up finishes, right? A lot of people don't remember that Prost, besides the 4 titles, also has 4 runner-up finishes. 11 medals on our medal table, right? He only loses to Hamilton and Schumacher. Record holder for wins with 51 and for podiums when he retired. Yeah, and only 33 poles, right? In 202 starts, right? It shows that explosive speed wasn't really his strength. Especially since during his peak of equipment dominance, which was that McLaren in 88 and 89, Senna ate his lunch when it came to pole positions, right? So there's also a bit of distortion in Prost's numbers there. But speaking of Prost and Senna, there's a really interesting number, right? 2 seasons of Prost and Senna as teammates in the best car on the grid, right? The McLaren from 88 and 89, and Prost scored more points in both, right? Prost loses the 88 title to Ayrton. A lot of Senna fans out there don't know that stat. Another thing, since we're talking about this Senna-Prost controversy, which I really like to bring up, because people get stuck with narratives they can't let go of anymore, right? They erase the facts in favor of the narratives, so to speak. Do you want to hear another one that's very common in among Brazilian Senna fans online? Prost stole the 89 title from Ayrton. Yeah, Ayrton wouldn't have been champion in 89. Yes, what Balestra did was a dirty move. Yes, Prost's maneuver was absurd, and today he would have been disqualified from that race. But Prost arrived at the 1989 Japanese GP 8 points ahead of Ayrton. He didn't need to do that, right? He was really traumatized by the humiliation in 88 when Senna stalled the car at the start and still passed him anyway. He said, no man, not today, you're not going to pass. And he preferred to crash into him. But if he had just stayed in second, just let Ayrton go and stayed in second. In Australia, all he had to do was be second to Ayrton again, and he would have been champion. So the 1989 title wasn't stolen by Alain Prost from Ayrton Senna. Under normal conditions, with no accidents, no Balestra, nothing, that's what was likely to happen, right? If Senna won the last 2, with Prost in second in both of those last races that year, Suzuka and Adelaide, Prost would still be champion anyway. The driver in 7th place is a good example that numbers aren't everything, right? Fernando Alonso is a 2-time Formula One world champion, but if you just distribute 8 little points throughout his 20-something year career, if you redistribute them, he could be a 5-time champion, right? Alonso lost a title by 1 point in 2007, a title by 4 points in 2010, and a title by 3 points in 2012, right? Yeah, and those titles in 2010 and 2012 that he lost driving for Ferrari to Vettel's Red Bull, right? He lost with a clearly inferior car. He scored almost as many points as that year's champion in a clearly inferior car, right? Yeah, Alonso is 5th in our medal table. Look how interesting that is, right? He's also on the list for most wins, right? Alonso has 32 wins, if I'm not mistaken. He's still in the top 5, right? Even though he only has 2 titles, he has other very strong stats, right? And the fact that Aston has been bad in recent years and terrible this year, right? Generation Z or Generation Alpha, Alonso doesn't do anything. It wasn't that long ago that the last medal Alonso got in our medal tally, by the way, was in 2023. He got bronze in 2023, right? So, yeah, in 2023, he showed, look, if you give me a good car, I'll get a streak of podiums, like he did at the start of 2023. He didn't get any wins because Red Bull was way too dominant, right? Yeah, Alonso, let's remember, right? Let's go back to our main criteria here. How much he is respected by his peers, how much he is feared by his peers. Alonso is the guy. I think that's partly why he hasn't stopped yet. He holds a grudge he'll never let go of and is convinced he's better than Vettel, which he is. He was better than Vettel, who has already retired. Yet, he only has half the titles. Deep down, he believes he's better than Hamilton, who has 7 titles, right? So, yeah, of course, Alonso's opinion is always going to be the best possible when it comes to judging himself, but he really was a guy who was very feared and respected by the others in Formula One, right? So, yeah, he's not higher in this ranking because making the right career decisions is also part of a driver's ability, right? He made a lot of wrong decisions. Actually, in 2007, I think the biggest mistake was Ron Dennis's, right? For not holding Hamilton back a little. Look, take a breath. This year belongs to Fernando, who's the established champion, 2-time champion. Next year, you're free. And then Alonso would have handled Hamilton going head-to-head with him better in the second year, right? In the first year, it was really hard to swallow. But he made a mistake, right? When it comes to getting involved with Stepney and threatening to tell the FIA, that's when he loses Ron Dennis's trust. And then he seals his own fate, right? He could have stayed at McLaren and won in 2007 if things had been a bit more harmonious, if Ron Dennis had managed things better. But if he had stayed at McLaren for 2008, he probably would have either come very close or even won that 2008 title. Even though McLaren wasn't competing for titles in 09 to 11, it was still better than the Renaults he drove then, right? He also leaves Ferrari because the relationship wore out, even though if he had just held on, right? That good phase Vettel had at Ferrari when Vettel when Vettel went head-to-head with Hamilton's hybrid Mercedes, I think Alonso would have been champion in those years. So that lack of human skills, right? Not being able to manage the team environment also cost Alonso. And that's why he's only the 7th greatest of all time on our list. But without a doubt, one of the 10 greatest talents in Formula One history. Number 6 in my ranking here, a name that's rarely remembered by Brazilian fans, right? But he's undoubtedly one of the greatest in Formula One, Jim Clark. Look, I was really tempted to put Jim Clark in the top 5, okay? It's just that the guys in the top 5 have really impressive numbers, right? And Clark is a guy whose career was cut very short, right? Yeah, he died at 32, right? Ayrton, for example, died at 34. Jim Clark died while leading the championship. He had won the first race that year, and it happened between the first and second races. So, that year he was already set to win what would have been his 3rd title. Yeah, he's a guy who could have been a 4-time, 5-time champion. Maybe even more, right? He was way above the average of his contemporaries, right? Even the titles he lost, right? The titles to Graham Hill. He won more races, but also had more breakdowns. He was that type of driver. If his car was best and didn't fail, he'd win, especially since he spent most of his career at Lotus. And Lotus was always notorious for having very fragile cars, right? But he died holding all the records in Formula One, right? 25 wins, 32 podiums, 33 poles. That was a record. Yeah, basically, if he made it to the end, he won, right? He had a 35% win rate. 45% pole rate, right? 33 poles and 73 GPs. His pole record was only broken by Senna back in '89, right? It lasted 30 years, right? 31 years. Yeah, like I said, it's not higher because then we start to speculate about what his career could have been, right? But he was a guy who was clearly. He put fear in the hearts of the other 20, right? He was on another level. That's how it goes, right? Kind of as a side gig, he tried at Indianapolis. He was winning one year but broke down. The next year he wins and still takes the 500 miles at Indianapolis. It's one of the big sadnesses, one of the tragedies of motorsport. Of course, not being able to have a more complete career. And he was also a really good guy, right? Scottish sheep farmer, simple guy. Anyway, now we're talking about a fight between giants. We're talking about our top five. Fifth place is the all-time medal leader on our list, Lewis Hamilton, right? 7 titles, 5 runner-ups, no bronze. Look how interesting. 12 medals, tied with Schumacher as well. That's a fun fact. They're tied in titles and tied in medals. But on the medal board, Hamilton has more silvers, right? Schumacher has a few bronzes. The fact that Hamilton is in his 40s and has been getting beaten by Leclerc in recent years, and even in his last year at Mercedes, he was kind of outperformed by Russell, the alpha generation, right? Who nowadays comment a lot on the internet, right? A lot of content creators. It kind of became a trend. Like, Hamilton wasn't that good. He won because of the Mercedes years. Let's remember a few things about Hamilton, right? Just to mention how great Hamilton is. Hamilton loses the title in his first year in Formula One by a point. Just like Hulk, he loses the title by a point. But do you know who his teammate was? It was the current 2-time Formula One champion and a guy who's on this list, 2 positions behind, Fernando Alonso. So, in Hamilton's first year in Formula One, he goes head-to-head with his teammate, who was clearly the best on the grid. The guy who had ended the Schumacher era, which is another thing I could have mentioned in favor of Alonso's ranking. He's our 7th here. He loses the title by a point, but becomes champion the next year, his second year. That's another stat proving how undeniable Lewis Hamilton is. He won races every year between 2007 and 2021, right? Another thing, with all kinds of cars, more competitive, less competitive. That 2009 McLaren, the year of Brawn, started off terribly. Hamilton bounces back late in the year and almost gets into the title fight. Yeah, he fights for titles too, not as strongly yet, but back in the Vettel years, he gave some scares in an inferior McLaren, right? Yeah, winning races for 14 years in a row, and in many of those 14 years, right? Not having the best car on the grid also shows the level at which he operates, at which Lewis Hamilton operated during most of his career. He's not at that level anymore, right? Hamilton's last really great year was 2021, right? He should have been champion, right? If I said that Niki Lauda is the moral 4-time champion because of the accident in '76, then Hamilton is the moral 8-time champion, right? The referee made a mistake. The referee in the World Cup final gave a ridiculous penalty, and the other team became champion. That's what happened to him in 2021. If he discredits Verstappen, right? If 2 guys arrive with a chance to be champion and it comes down to the details, both had the moral merit to be champions. But what was the decisive factor in 2021, right? In this detail, it was Michael Masi's mistake. Just like in 2007, right? What was the decisive factor for losing by a point to Hamilton? It was all the internal politics inside McLaren. That weird gearbox hiccup at La Regina in Interlagos, right? So, like, with just 2 tiny adjustments, Hamilton could have been the F1 champion instead of me. It's crazy to think about. And even so, he's only 5th on this list because the top 4 are even further ahead. And it also shows, right, that it's not a list where numbers are everything, right? Hamilton is the leader, the record holder of the table. He's the leader of the medal table. He's still the record holder, right? For wins, podiums, and poles, right? The only guy with more than 100 wins more than 100 poles. But he was also greatly benefited by those years with the hybrid Mercedes when his teammates weren't that strong. So, the guys who are above him on my list are better than him. An orchestra plays the victory theme, which Rupa Nova performs. Did you know that? It was Rupa Nova, the band Rupa Nova, who recorded that song. It's Ayrton Senna da Silva, Ayrton Senna from Brazil, the 4th greatest of all time on my list here. By my conservative estimates, Senna would have been a 6-time champion, right? If his career hadn't been abruptly cut short by a suspension bar. What bad luck, right? It broke through right at the most vulnerable spot on the helmet, right? I think both of Schumacher's titles with Benetton in '94 and '95 would have been his, I think especially '95, right? In 94, he was already 30-0 behind Schumacher. That Benetton had questionable legality, right? It supposedly had traction control. It really was a very strong car, right? I think then the guys, but Hill lost by just a few points. Schumacher was excluded from 4 races that year, precisely because the FIA had to step in. That was during Bernie Ecclestone's era, right? There was a lot of politics going on. Yeah, something had to be done there. There's video. I've already made that projection, right? Of all of Senna's titles. But for you, who's from the Alpha generation and doesn't remember or hasn't researched it but still comments. Even so, it's just so you can get an idea. Schumacher, for overtaking the safety car at the Belgian Grand Prix, was excluded from the race and banned from the next one, right? He got a 2-race suspension. 2 exclusions for overtaking under the safety car, right? You can see exactly what the FIA was trying to do there to save the championship. Under normal conditions, I think Schumacher would have won in 94. Yeah, but I think in 95 Ayrton, right? Developing the Williams and all, he would have gone head-to-head with Schumacher. I don't think Renault would have gone to Benetton, right? Yeah, Ayrton wouldn't have let Williams release the Renault engine to Benetton with Schumacher there, and Senna would have won in 95. And then, without a doubt, right? 96, 97, he would have won the titles that Hill and Villeneuve got. But then, we're talking IFs, right? But just to give some perspective, right? Senna is a 3-time champion who, under normal circumstances in life, would have been a 6-time champion. He held a unique record when he died, right? In Formula One, he was the record holder for poles. 65 poles. That's an absurd pole percentage, right? Senna has 40% of poles. That's 161 starts, right? And 65 poles. And he only had the best car on the grid in 4 out of his 10 seasons, right? Which are the 4 years with McLaren, right? 88, 89, 90, and 91. So 84, 85, 86, 87, 92, 93. I won't even count 94, right? He's still got 3 poles, right? Yeah, but having a 40% pole rate in your career, considering you only had the best car on the grid in only 40% of your seasons, is really impressive. And it gives you a sense of what Senna's pure speed was like, right? He's 8th in the medal table with 6 curiously tied. Do you know with whom? Nelson Piquet also has 6. Senna has, 3 golds, 2 silvers, right? And a bronze in 87 with Lotus. When it comes to pure speed, to the panic he caused in others' hearts, especially in wheel-to-wheel battles, he's the greatest of all time, right? Yeah, but that's the main criterion, but it's not the only one here, right? Senna isn't ranked higher because he has bigger weaknesses, right? Broader than the 3 guys ahead of him here, right? We're in very rarefied air. We're at the top of Everest here, right? You literally start splitting hairs to tell the difference. So Senna had this kind of messianic attitude, right? He was a very religious guy. Some would even say a religious fanatic. And that, in his mind, created a mindset that sometimes even harmed him, right? He would go into a trance, see God, and I think, to sum up how this got in his way as a driver, I think sometimes he believed he had a divine right to win, right? And there's another guy who's even above him here on the list. We'll talk about him too, but not for religious reasons. But what's the deal? What did this actually mean in practice? He was very relentless in wheel-to-wheel battles, right? And he wouldn't accept certain things, and that often got him tangled up, right? How many times did he get tangled up with Mansell in situations that really mattered, right? Grand Prix starts when he was ahead and ended up getting tangled. Getting tangled up with a back marker and throwing away a sure victory, right? Like he did with Schleicher in Monza. He did it with Nakata, Kojima in Brazil, right? Man, years and years chasing a win at home, and then you're leading your home Grand Prix with a huge gap, and you get tangled up with a back marker, right? You've never seen Schumacher do that. You've never seen Hamilton do that. You've never seen Alonso do that, right? Even those below him on the list show it was a weakness, right? This thing about him, he really wanted to show that he was much better than Prost. So he tried to lap Prost in Monaco. 88 crashed by himself with a 30-second lead, right? Yeah, you never really saw these top drivers do that. The guy who did something similar, as I remember, was Vettel in the rain, right? In his home race in Germany, but in the rain. And look, Vettel isn't in the top 10 here exactly because there were gaps, right? He had bigger weaknesses. But, undoubtedly, right, the greatest Brazilian of all time when it comes to driving a box with 4 wheels. So let's go to our podium. In 3rd place, him, El Maestro, Juan Manuel Fangio, right? When I started to like racing back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was undeniable that Fangio was like the Pelé of soccer, you know? Yeah, Fangio was undoubtedly the greatest driver of his era. Undeniable. There will always be 10 or 15 haters who want to create an alternative story, but Fangio's numbers were really overwhelming, right? Fangio, some things about him will never be beaten, right? Fangio was a five-time champion with four different teams, right? I think it will be hard for anyone to be champion with four different teams in the future in Formula One. He was the record holder for everything when he retired, still at the beginning of Formula One, right? But 24 wins, 29 poles, and 35 podiums. Win percentage is 46%, pole percentage is 55%, right? Those two records will never be broken. There are those asterisks, right? That there were some wins there, more wins than even points, right? You could take your teammate's car. You couldn't win races that way due to a problem, but you could use your teammate's car to score points and win a championship, not individual races. It doesn't distort the number of wins, but it helps Fangio's 5 titles, right? But there are other big asterisks too, which is this. Fangio's best years were lost to the war, right? Formula One didn't start earlier because of the war. So, when Formula One comes around, Fangio is already over 40, right? He wins all his titles after turning 40. And he was Fangio. He was able to be very fast when needed, which was the race there. I said that Prost doesn't have remarkable victories. Fangio's victory at Nürburgring in 57 is considered one of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest, right? He broke the lap record lap after lap. And when he broke it for the last time, he had lowered the track record by 17 seconds, right? Yeah, because he was making up for the setback he had with the problem. So, if he needed to, he was relentless. But he knew that most of the time, he didn't need to. He had plenty of margin. He was so much better than the others that he didn't need to get 100% out of the car to win. And this philosophy of his was best summed up in a phrase. He was a smart guy too, right? He left a memorable quote, didn't he? Always strive to be the best, but never believe you are the best. You need to stay motivated and work hard, because thinking you're the best reveals your weaknesses. And the other phrase that I think exemplifies his impact, right? It's there at the Fangio Museum, right? It's friend and idol of many, master of all, right? He was a friend to many and a teacher, a master to all. You can't put him above the other two here because the numbers are also overwhelming, right? So, the second greatest driver of all time. But look, in about 5 or 6 years, we'll redo this list and he'll be in first place. Max Verstappen, right? Maximilian Verstappen. That idea from Jos was curious, right? I think he wanted to name him Max, and his wife must have decided, no, then make it Maximilian. He named him Maximilian Verstappen. He'll hold every record when he retires, right? He's not the record holder for anything yet in terms of absolute numbers because he hasn't stopped yet. But Max is only 28 years old, guys. He has 71 wins at 28 years old. 28 years old is the age when Senna went to McLaren, right? Senna became champion for the first time at 28. He almost became champion last year with a much inferior car, right? Much inferior. He carried the car on his back, and that's very rare in Formula One. Man, really losing by 2 points, right? The title fight he was in last year was the biggest comeback in history, right? Yeah, because it really was a comeback that he built on the track, right? Kimi's case isn't quite the same. Kimi in 2007. But even Kimi in 2007 is much more about an internal implosion at McLaren than really Kimi starting a streak of several races and coming back, right? It's like Zach Brown said last year. He said, he's the villain in a horror movie, right? That guy you think is already dead, but he comes back and reappears, right? With the axe. Verstappen even joked in a press conference and said, call me Chuck, right? So call me Chuck. That's exactly it. He's a really relentless guy, right? I think this year already shows the size of his talent, right? First of all, the level at which he crushed all his teammates is something never seen before, right? I've never seen anyone destroy careers, one after another, like Verstappen did, right? Ricardo, when he saw things going that way, said, whoa, let me get out of here before I start getting crushed. Then he buries Gasly's career, buries Albon's career, buries Perez's career, buries Tsunoda's career, buries Lawson's career, and now Radiar has started, right? When the car was running back there in the first 3 races, Radiar wasn't even that far behind. Now in Miami, right? I'm recording this right now, right after the Miami GP, where, hey, it looks like Red Bull picked up the pace. Boom! Max in second, almost on pole. Radiar already starts in 8th, already gets all tangled up, crashes by himself in the first laps. It's starting to look like, hey, is Radiar starting to feel the heat now? Yeah, we've had a lot, right? Senna always dominated his teammates, but like to retire them, to crush them, right? To just, wow, this guy here, bam, love him and then toss him aside. He's not fit for a top team consistently with so many guys. Yeah, it's not easy to be Max Verstappen's teammate. And what's going to happen? Either Red Bull will be able to develop, and we're seeing it, right? With these new regulations, these crazy powertrains, there are some very rapid gains, right? Like take McLaren or even Red Bull, who seem to be about a second behind. Suddenly, they're already kind of fighting up front with Mercedes. So it's hard to predict, right, how the development curves will be this year. But it's one of two things, right? Either Red Bull around July or August will be promising enough to look like they can fight for something next year. Yeah, and he stays at Red Bull and fights for the title in 2027. Or it will be clear that Red Bull still won't be ready to fight for the title in 2027. And he'll call Toto and he'll go to Mercedes and he'll start stacking up titles in a Mercedes era, right? So, does anyone doubt that Verstappen will be a 6-time, 7-time champion? No one doubts it, right? And then, when he actually retires, we'll be able to look at his career and put it into perspective in relation to other careers. Of Hamilton, of drumroll, leader of our top 10 greatest drivers of all time, ranking Michael Schumacher. For me, not only the greatest I've ever seen, but he's the leader, of course, by the criteria I've set here, right? Schumacher put fear in the hearts of the others for a longer period than anyone else, right? Schumacher had like a window from 94 to 2004, right? Which is his last title. And you kind of knew like, man, for Schumacher not to win this weekend, he'd have to have a much worse car. Much worse, right? He was, just like Verstappen is today, clearly a step above the rest of the grid, right? If you're going to rank the current Formula One grid, there's a tier that's just Verstappen. Then there's the second tier, Leclerc, Norris, Alonso still, even though he's older, Hamilton still, even though he's older, right? But Verstappen is on another level compared to the rest. Schumacher was on another level compared to the rest for 10 years, right? From Ayrton's death until Alonso's rise, which also highlights Alonso's position on this list here, Schumacher held all the records when he retired, right? 91 wins, 66 poles. He's still the record holder for fastest laps to this day. No one has beaten that, right? Schumacher retired at a high level. Let's set aside his return with Mercedes. He stopped 20 years ago and is still the record holder for fastest laps to this day. He's tied with Hamilton at the top of our medal table, but loses the tiebreaker, right? He has 2 silvers and 3 bronzes, correct? But both have 7 golds, and Schumacher's percentages are stronger, right? He has 308 starts. Hamilton is getting close to 400. It's 384, right? He almost became champion with much inferior cars, right? In 99, if he hadn't broken his leg, he probably would have been champion with a much weaker car. Yeah, in 96 and 97, he was almost champion with a car much weaker than Villeneuve's Williams. In 96, the car was a piece of junk, and he still managed, wow, 3 wins by squeezing everything out, right? And then there was Benetton, right? It's a mid-level team that had never really been a title contender, right? Benetton had never fought for the title before. He not only joins Benetton and makes them fight for the title, but also wins 2 titles with relative ease, right? He becomes champion in 94 racing in only 12 out of 16 races. The only guy in history who raced 75% of the championship and still became champion, just like that. But Rio won for, yes, Schumacher raced in 75% of the races that year. No, he raced 14 out of 16 and still became champion. 95 was a massacre. And then he still had the guts, right, to say, wait, no, I'm going to do something different here. I'm really going to put my name in the history books by making Ferrari champion again after more than 20 years. Hello, Alpha Generation. Honestly, I feel a bit resentful toward you. You can see today how hard it is to make Ferrari champions, right? It also puts Vettel's and Alonso's failures to do that in better perspective. Yeah, Ferrari is once again going on 20 years without winning anything. They need another Messiah to come and do something that Hamilton at 40 years old won't be able to do, especially because of Hamilton's personality, right? Hamilton isn't that kind of guy. Schumacher was like that gravitational sun, right? That made everything revolve around him, just like Ayrton, right? Ferrari now would need Verstappen, right? A guy who comes in and says, look, I'm going to do it. But the team principal, the race director, the engineer, I'm the one who's going to decide. The designer, I'm the one who's going to pick all those guys. and then we're going to be champions. And it's not going to be right away, huh? It's going to take 3, 4, 5 years. That's what Schumacher did, right? Can you imagine Verstappen taking on something like that nowadays? Nobody wants to take that on anymore, right? After what happened with Vettel, with Alonso, with what's happening now with Leclerc, it's hard to find that messiah out there. Schumacher crushed all his teammates, right? Yeah, he ended careers too in that sense, right? Guys like Johnny Herbert, like Martin Brundle, even Jos Verstappen, right? But Herbert and Brundle, yeah, they were underperforming compared to Schumacher. Then after the monster Schumacher showed his true size, they were even winning a few races from time to time, right? It's just that Schumacher was really something else. Yeah, and then after the Mercedes period, right? Recently, we know, right? He ended up hitting his head during that time he was riding a motorcycle. Right after he stopped. Then he was never really the same again, you know? He was already getting old too. And then he ended up being beaten by Rosberg. Here's one last fun fact about the medal table. Do you know who's in fourth place on the medal table? Sebastian Vettel, right? Vettel has 9 medals, but he didn't make it into the top 10 here. He'd be my 11th if we extended the list. The other person who'd be in the top 10 of the medal table but isn't in my top 10 list I've already mentioned. That's right, Saint Piquet is 9th, tied in medals with Ayrton. But Ayrton has more silvers. He would be my 12th if we were making a top 12. So, what do you think? What's your top 10 greatest of all time in Formula One? Leave it in the comments. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. That always helps us a lot. As always, thanks a lot. Take care and a big hug. We're already counting down to the Canadian Grand Prix.